Hey Clover Tribe! Quick question. What if I told you there's an entire generation walking around with a completely different operating system in their brain? Not because of genetics, not because of some supplement or ancient wisdom, but because they grew up in a world where no algorithm decided what they saw next. Gen X, born roughly between 1965 and 1980, is the last generation that came of age before the feed, before autoplay, before the platform decided your reality for you. And here's the wild part. That absence left a mark. It literally wired their brains differently. They process choice, boredom, and information in ways that younger generations can't even imagine. And older generations never had to. Today, we're breaking down the invisible cognitive systems that made Gen X the ultimate psychological outlier. And once you see it, you'll understand why they seem so unbothered by the chaos that drives everyone else insane. Let's go. Starting with number 8, Gen X developed what neuroscientists might call boredom immunity. But it's not what you think. They didn't learn to tolerate boredom, they learned to use it. Before smartphones, before infinite scroll, kids in the 70s and 80s had massive stretches of unstructured, unstimulated time. No one was going to entertain them. So their brains did something incredible. They started generating their own meaning. They invented games. They created entire fictional universes. They got weird. And here's the kicker. Boredom is one of the most powerful cognitive states for creativity. When your brain isn't being fed content, it starts making connections on its own. It wanders. It problem solves. It gets curious. Gen X's brains were essentially put through a daily creativity boot camp. And the result is a generation that doesn't panic when there's nothing to do. They just start something. Meanwhile, younger generations experience boredom as a threat because they've been algorithmically conditioned to expect stimulation on demand. The absence of content feels like a void. For Gen X, it's just Tuesday. Number 7. Gen X's taste was shaped by gatekeepers, and that created something unexpected: depth. Before Spotify, before YouTube recommendations, before TikTok virality, you couldn't just discover anything. If you wanted music, you had 3 options: radio DJs, MTV, or your cooler older siblings' CD collection. If you wanted movies, you had whatever was playing at the theatre or on TV that weekend. If you wanted information, you had the encyclopedia, the library, or a single nightly news broadcast. This created scarcity, and scarcity creates value. When you only had access to a limited pool of culture, you consumed it deeply. You listened to the same album 30 times. You memorized every line of the movie you rented. You became an expert in the small slice of the world you could access. And here's the paradox: limited access created better taste. Because when you can't consume everything, you learn to evaluate quality. You develop judgment. You commit. Gen X didn't have a shallow relationship with 1,000 artists. They had a deep relationship with 10. And that changes how you think about everything. Number 6. Gen X learned patience because everything required friction. Want to watch a movie? Drive to Blockbuster, hope it's in stock, rewind the tape when you're done. Want to talk to your friend? Call their landline, hope they're home, leave a message, wait. Want to know something? Look it up in a book, or wait until someone who knows tells you. Every single action had steps, delays, obstacles. And here's what that did. It taught their brains that reward requires effort, that waiting is normal, that you don't get what you want instantly, and that's fine. Psychologists call this delayed gratification, and it's one of the strongest predictors of long-term success and emotional regulation. But more than that, friction taught Gen X to evaluate whether something was worth the effort. If you had to drive across town to rent a movie, you made sure it was a good one. You didn't waste your time on garbage. Meanwhile, modern platforms remove all friction, and the result is that people consume impulsively, endlessly, without ever stopping to ask if it's worth it. Gen X's brains are wired to pause, and that's a superpower. Number 5. Gen X built their identity by hand, and no one was watching. This is huge. Today, identity is performed. You post, you get feedback, you adjust. Your sense of self is constantly shaped by likes, comments, shares. It's a feedback loop. But Gen X grew up in a world where no one was watching. There was no audience, no metrics, no algorithm validating or punishing your choices. So they made choices in private. They tried on different identities: punk, goth, skater, nerd, not for clout, but because they were genuinely curious. They explored who they were without worrying about how it would land with an audience. And because there was no external validation system, their sense of self became internal. They developed what psychologists call an intrinsic locus of identity, meaning they knew who they were because they decided, not because the crowd told them. Compare that to growing up with Instagram, where your identity is co-created with thousands of strangers in real time, where you can see exactly how many people liked the version of you that you posted today. It's not better or worse, it's just a completely different psychological experience. Gen X's brains formed self-concept in isolation, and once that's set, it's incredibly hard to manipulate. At number 4, Gen X is the only generation that remembers both worlds, and that gives them a unique psychological lens. They grew up analog, but they adapted to digital. They remember what life was like before the internet, but they're not confused by it now. They saw the transition happen in real time. And that dual perspective creates something rare: metacognition, the ability to see the system from the outside. Most younger people can't imagine life without the algorithm because they've never experienced it. Most older people can't adapt to the algorithm because it's too foreign. But Gen X exists in the overlap. They can code switch between the old world and the new. They know what it's like to be unreachable. They also know what it's like to have infinite access. They've lived both realities. And here's why that matters. When you can see both sides of a transformation, you're less likely to be captured by either extreme. You become psychologically flexible. You don't worship the past, but you also don't blindly accept the present. Gen X looks at modern digital life and thinks, this is useful, but I don't need it to survive. That detachment is a defense mechanism, and it's incredibly powerful. Number 3. Gen X developed emotional intelligence the hard way, face-to-face, in real time, with no edits. Every social interaction was live. No texting to think through your response. No deleting a message if it came out wrong. If you wanted to talk to someone, you had to do it in person or on the phone. And that meant reading tone, body language, facial expressions, all in the moment. You learned to navigate conflict without a block button. You learn to interpret nuance without an emoji to clarify intent. This is critical. Modern digital communication is asynchronous and curated. You can craft the perfect message, wait to respond, control exactly how you're perceived. It's psychologically safer, but it also removes the training ground for real-time emotional intelligence. Gen X didn't have that safety net. They had to learn empathy, negotiation, and social calibration on the fly. And the research backs this up. Studies show that face-to-face communication activates mirror neurons and builds emotional attunement in ways that text-based communication simply doesn't. Gen X's brains are wired for in-person connection. They can read a room. They can sense when someone's lying. They trust their gut because their gut was trained in analog reality, not digital abstraction. Number 2. Gen X learned to distrust authority, and it became a survival instinct. They grew up during Watergate, the Iran-Contra scandal, corporate downsizing, and the complete collapse of institutional trust. They watched their parents get laid off after decades of loyalty. They saw politicians lie on national television. They learned early that the system doesn't care about you, and no one's coming to save you. So they developed a psychological immune system: skepticism. Not cynicism, skepticism. They question everything, but they're not nihilistic about it. They just assume that whoever's talking probably has an agenda. And in the age of algorithmic manipulation, that instinct is incredibly useful. Younger generations grew up in a world where platforms were designed to feel personalized and trustworthy. The algorithm gives you exactly what you want, so it feels like it's on your side. But Gen X remembers when corporations were openly adversarial. They don't trust the feed. They don't assume the platform has their best interests at heart. They see the game. And here's the thing, that skepticism makes them harder to manipulate. You can't sell them a worldview with a slick video and a viral narrative. They're going to ask, who benefits from me believing this? And that's a question the algorithm doesn't want you to ask. And finally, number 1. Gen X can actually log off. And that might be the most radical skill of all. For younger generations, disconnection feels like punishment, like missing out, like social death, because they've been conditioned to believe that if you're not online, you don't exist. The algorithm rewards constant presence. The culture demands it. Being offline is seen as opting out of life itself. But Gen X grew up in a world where being unreachable was the default. If you weren't home, people just waited. If you missed something, you heard about it later. There was no FOMO because there was no feed to scroll. Life happened whether you were watching or not, and that was fine. So when Gen X logs off now, it's not a big existential crisis. It's just normal. They don't feel like they're missing anything because their brains weren't trained to expect infinite access in the first place. They can put the phone down and not check it for hours. They can take a weekend without Wi-Fi and feel fine. They can disconnect without feeling like they're disappearing. And in a world where the attention economy is literally designed to make disconnection impossible, that ability is a form of freedom. Gen X's brains still remember what it's like to just be, and no algorithm can take that away. So here's the big picture. Gen X isn't just nostalgic for a simpler time. They're living proof that the absence of algorithmic infrastructure creates a fundamentally different kind of mind. A mind that doesn't need constant stimulation. A mind that questions authority by default. A mind that can disconnect without falling apart. And the wildest part, they're not even aware of how rare that is. To them, this is just how brains work. But for everyone who came after, growing up inside the feed, these abilities seem almost superhuman. Boredom immunity, delayed gratification, intrinsic identity, emotional intelligence, skepticism, the ability to log off. These aren't skills you can learn from a course. They're cognitive structures that were built in childhood, when the brain is most plastic, most impressionable. And once the algorithm takes over that formative window, those structures don't develop the same way. It's not better or worse. It's just different. So the next time you see a Gen Xer shrug at the chaos, unbothered by the feed, completely fine doing nothing for an afternoon, now you know why. Their brains were built in a different world, and that world left a mark. I'm Willow, and until next time, stay skeptical, stay grounded, and mind yourself. I'll see you in the next one.